Hey TYB, well, welcome to the book of Haggai. Now we are going to do Haggai and Zechariah together because these two prophets prophesied to the same people at the same time and together. So we really want to sit the books in the Bible in the right context. So we've only got one part in Haggai because it's a tiny book. It's only 2 chapters. And then we're going to do 2 parts in Zechariah. So the history is really going to mix up. So do them together so you really get the fullness of the books that you're reading. Now, where are we? We are in Haggai. And Haggai, as I said, is a short book. It's only 2 chapters, but it really sits into the historical context of Ezra. So what we do when we read our Bible, it's in our 12 prophet section again. It's one of our smaller books of the prophetic books. It's in our prophetic section and in the Old Testament. And what we do with the prophets, remember, is we jump back into the books, the historical books of Kings and Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah to really find out the time that these prophets were prophesying and what they're prophesying to. Because if you know the message without the context, it gets a little bit confusing. So what we're going to do with Haggai is we're going to jump back to Ezra because Haggai is prophesying. Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi prophesy in this post-exilic stage. What does that mean? After the 70 years of exile, you've got these 3 prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, that are prophesying into the building of the second temple, into the building of the walls, and into the future of what does Israel look like after exile. And it's a really incredible way to read it in the history of the book. So jump back to Ezra with me, and we're going to have a look at the beginning of Ezra. Now we know the beginning of Ezra is that King Cyrus of Persia does an edict and sends them back, which is just incredible, sends them out of exile, sends them back into to rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Now, what fascinates me about is the interconnectedness of the Bible, because I know that when you look at King Cyrus of Persia, I can jump back and think, wait a second, I've heard Persia before. Who's also in Persia? And I know that in Daniel 10, it talks about Daniel being in Persia with King Cyrus. So maybe Daniel was in the mix of getting the guys sent back to Jerusalem. We don't know. How cool is that? We can ask when we get to heaven. We can ask Daniel. And then when you sort of feel this interconnectedness, now what's happening in Ezra? They've sent them back. Now Zerubbabel and Joshua are all going back out of exile, back into Jerusalem. This is an incredible moment because they're coming from 70 years in exile and they're coming back into Jerusalem to rebuild Jerusalem, and an edict from the king of Persia. That is just amazing. And so we've got this beautiful sound in Ezra 1-5. Now some scholars believe that the guy who led this was Sheshbazzar. Now you're going to read in some commentaries that Sheshbazzar led them back out of exile, and I'm like, wait a second, I've never heard that word. Sheshbazzar is actually part of this first couple of chapters as Ezra, but Zerubbabel and Joshua and the high priest guys are still there, so they're leading them back out of exile. And then we have this incredible time when we're in Ezra. Open up and have a look at Ezra at the end of Ezra chapter 4. And they're building, and then they hit the enemy. They get discouraged because they're looking at Jerusalem, and it's horrible. It's in ruins. It's, you know, when you get discouraged in the vision of God, when you're in reality, and you're like, how is this going to happen? And then they're building, and then the king, they have these people that go back to the governor of Persia, and to get him to rescind the edict. And you can read it in Ezra. And at the end of 4, it says this in 24. Thus the work on the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So it came to a standstill, and history tells us that nothing happened for 17 years. 16 to 17 years, it just stopped because of the discouragement, because of the edict, and they waited, and then Darius, king of Persia, came into power. But wait, there's more. Don't you love it? God always has hope in the midst of when things go wrong. Chapter 5:1 starts with, now Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet, a descendant of Edo, we're going to talk about him in Zechariah, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. And then we start to get these prophets rising up. After 17 years of discouragement, Haggai and Zechariah rise up and say, no, this is what God is saying, build again. So in the context of encouraging a discouraged people, in the context of encouraging people to really step into what God has called them to do, after 17 years of discouragement, that's a long time, we have Haggai. Now, who is Haggai? Let me find the book of Haggai. Haggai is this incredible prophet. His name means festal. meaning like a festival, festal. It means like procession, like worship. What he's called to do is restore joy and worship and this festival feeling and worship of Yahweh back to Jerusalem, because they're discouraged. And you know, when you're discouraged, you just need people to pick you up and get that worship back in your mouth. And this is what Haggai does. It's incredible. Now we know at date he's prophesying. Now a prophet. A prophet is speaking on behalf of God, the message of God. And most of the times we just hear his message. Sometimes in Jonah, for example, we get to know about Jonah. In some of the books, we get to know the weird things that they do, like in Ezekiel and all the different weird things that Ezekiel did. But in Haggai, we get to see both sides. We get to see what he prophesies and then the response. And that's really rare in these prophetic books, that we actually get to see that they answered God. So cool. No rebellion after exile. Exile's done them good. And now they're actually doing what God says. So what date are we? We're in the second year of King Darius, on the first day of the 6th month. Can you hear the same thing? King Darius is in power, and Ezra and Haggai and Zechariah start to prophesy. The word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to who? To Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest, and to the people of Judah, the remnant of Judah. So he's prophesying directly to the leaders who are building the temple and in post-exile, after the exile, and they're rebuilding the temple of God in Jerusalem. And that's Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the remnant of Judah. Now I know that at this time it's about 520 BC. We are so close. We're only 500 years to Jesus. Oh my gosh, we're getting there. And King Darius reigned about 521 to 486 BC. So we're in this period. Again, we're in post-exile period. We're out of exile now. We've come out of exile for 70 years, and we're now rebuilding Jerusalem. And we're in the Ezra, Nehemiah books. Okay, so after 70 years, you know, we have this sense of rebuilding, and it's discouraging, and it's everything that is happening. And they're trying to get this temple rebuilt, and the prophets come in. Now, Haggai prophesies for 4 months. Only 4 months. There's 4 sets of speeches, a bit more like sermons than they are speeches, and he only prophesies for 4 months. After 2 months of prophesying, we're going to find out in the Zechariah studies that Zechariah jumps in 2 months, and they prophesy in tandem for the end 2 months, because Zechariah's got a very different feel to Haggai. Haggai is direct speech to Zerubbabel and to Joshua, and it's direct, whereas Zechariah's got a little bit more of an apocalyptic revelation vision feel. So you're going to feel that as you go through. Now, he's prophesying to, as I said, about 520 BC, he starts to prophesy. And let me show you these incredible moments. He puts dates throughout it. So what does that mean? That he's got these dates so you can really feel the history of what he's prophesying into. And you feel that this sense of, he talks about in the second year of King Darius, on the 21st day of the 7th month, I spoke this to Zerubbabel. I'm in chapter 2. And it goes through, I love it. It talks about the house of the Lord. You know, how many times have you heard this in a tithe and offering message or something like that? It says, you know, it's time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while the house remains in ruin. He's saying, guys, you're living in your paneled houses, and the house of Jerusalem, the house of the temple of Jerusalem's in ruins. Rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem. How cool is that? Can you feel this sound of encouragement? Now, we know that only about 42,000 of the remnant actually came back. 7,000 plus of those were actually slaves. So there's not a lot of people that have come back after exile. We know, for example, Daniel remained in exile. He remained where he was. Esther remains in exile. So as you go through this, as you run through this book, don't think that everybody came back to help, because it wasn't this mass everyone in. This was a remnant that was rebuilding the house of God. And sometimes in church life, it feels a bit like the remnant are building the house of God. Anyone? You know, we're all doing everything, but don't be discouraged, because the remnant built the temple in Jerusalem again, and they got it done. We know that Haggai prophesied and the temple was built. So don't you love that sound of what Haggai prophesied was completed? Now, again, it's very sermon-like. It's 4 different sermons. It's very story-like in its progression as it runs through. It's only 2 chapters, so it's a really fun book to just kind of sit in the history of it, really feel it talks about the day of the Lord. It talks about Yahweh returning in the presence of the Father. All this thing to get them out of discouragement talks about social justice and homelessness. It's saying, come on, activate, do something. I know the enemy is strong out there, and I know that they're telling you that you can't do this, but do something, because God is with you. I think in post-exile Jerusalem, it would have been very hard, because you've just been in exile for 70 years, and almost like this sense of, it's like being in not punishment, but being, in punishment for 70 years, and then you come back and you're not quite sure how to act. But there's this beautiful sense of God is with you, don't be discouraged. Haggai's message is all about restoration and hope. And he gets them to rebuild the temple of the Lord, which is just incredible. It's directly to the Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the remnant of Judah to get building. And he talks about the restoration of the promises of God to David, the Davidic line. You're going to feel this Old Testament promise come through. Be inspired and empowered by this incredible power-packed 2-chapter book as you jump into the history of Ezra and what's happening in that time, and this discouragement on them, and this sense of the prophet saying, time to rebuild. Stop being discouraged. Get back on the vision of God. The promise is yet to be fulfilled. So jump in as you jump into Haggai, and don't forget, we'll see you next part as you study Zechariah with us next.